Little did we think at the end of January, when we were all joyously emerging from the COVID lockdowns, that within a month we would be facing a war in Eastern Europe that would become an existential threat to our democracy as well as our very way of life. Sadly, as we all know, this is exactly what is happening in Ukraine now. And so our thoughts and prayers go to the Ukrainian people at this tragic time. I will, if I may, tell you a little bit about Universal Defence and Security Solutions, or UDSS as we call it. We are a global defence consultancy providing specialist defence and wider security advice, assistance and solutions to governments as well as businesses. Research has revealed that we are unique in the world and having the largest pool of former UK military, from 4-star to warrant officer across land, sea, air and civil service. As a result, we're able to provide policy and strategy through to technical advice across the entire breadth of the defence and security sectors and in all domains, including cyber and space. And by security sectors, I mean all businesses, large and small, because our digital space is under threat, now so more than ever before. In this webinar, we're seeking to do two things. Firstly, to explain some of the traps and danger zones for businesses that the new sanctions regime has created. And secondly, to provide an insight into some of the issues that may affect our supply chains, with particular emphasis on the military approach. And this is because the UK military supply chains have inbuilt resilience. And we believe that the private sector has a lot to learn from our experience. So now let me introduce my two expert colleagues. First to speak will be Julia Grainger, who is our head of compliance and an international trade consultant. Julia is an internationally recognized compliance and risk specialist with over 25 years experience in anti-bribery and corruption, as well as in international export trade controls and sanctions. She has led on the design and implementation of global compliance programs for companies involved in technology, manufacturing, specialty chemicals, fuel production, and many others. She is considered an expert advisor on the development, improvement, and deployment of internal compliance policies and procedures, so as to address the changes within national and international legislation. Julia is also an authority on EU and US export control regulations, including relevant sanction regimes, as well as both UK Bribery Act, Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, and data management requirements. Second to speak will be Major General David Shoesmith, who is a director of UDSS with a particular focus on supply chain resilience and logistics. David gained his experience in operational military logistics, support and acquisition in both the MOD and the commercial sector. His 28-year military career included service as Assistant Chief of the Defence Staff for Logistic Operations, namely the Senior Logistician in the UK MOD, as well as Logistic Command from squadron to brigade level, including being on operations from Bosnia to Afghanistan. He has also been responsible for instigating a range of acquisition and support transformation initiatives across defence. And since leaving the military, he's advised a range of commercial clients in a variety of sectors on market strategy, critical program management, and strategic supply chain. He is an active proponent for industry doing more to deliver cost-effective defence capability, especially in the logistics and support arena. So now over to you, Julia.
Thank you, Peter, and welcome everybody. It's good to sort of virtually meet you all and welcome you to this webinar where I think probably what I'd like to do is maybe just give you, to start with, a little bit of background in terms of sanctions and where they've come from and where we are today. And obviously it's not going to have evaded you that there's been quite a bit of action. The current level of sanctions implementation is historic. They're very complex, very fast moving. They're being implemented by many, many countries which are rolling out their sanctions programs to an unprecedented degree. And I hate to use that word because I think it's overused sometimes, but we've got EU, UK, Germany, France, Italy, Switzerland, Japan, Canada, et al., and also Russia, which is issuing their own counter sanctions, which we'll touch on later as well. There are also legal and practical impacts on businesses, and these vary depending on the size of business, the lines of business, geographic areas of operation, and other factors. So I think, as I say, just a little bit background. Some of you may be more than well aware of where sanctions have come from and how they've been implemented, particularly in the UK. But obviously, what we have now in the UK since 2018, when the introduction of the Sanctions and Anti-Money Laundering Act was introduced, that would provided basically the framework through which sanctions can be imposed and updated following the departure of the UK from the EU. What we then have is the UK sanctions. They provide prohibitions and the requirements of those sanctions, and that's imposed by the Russian Sanctions EU Exit Regulations 2019, which is a rather snappy title, I know, but that's basically the UK legislation, and there are others globally, and they impose regulations variously around finance, trade, transport, including aircraft and shipping, immigration sanctions, and these sorts of things. So when we take a step back and we look at the Russian sanctions specifically, if you go back to 2014, the sanctions at that point, they were much more targeted around the oil and gas industry. The new sanctions regimes that we're seeing take this much further and really target the financial systems. So, for instance, Russia has built up its gold reserves. That's not going to take an awful lot of time to start working through as we sort of start diminishing the amount of available capital available in Russia. So the initial steps the UK government and other governments took were to impose sanctions targeting the central bank of the Russian Federation. This restricted its ability to engage in foreign transactions to support the Russian ruble. Subsequent activity has then looked to include powers against the Russian financial sector more widely, including preventing Russian banks from clearing payments in sterling, for instance, or the Russian state from raising debt in the UK. So what current sanctions have done is effectively cut Russia off from the global financial system, as I say, first targeting the largest banks, and then what we've seen more recently is some of maybe the smaller banks, but also those banks which have been removed from the SWIFT system, which is the messaging system used to manage financial transactions between banks. The banking sanctions themselves vary from prohibitions on correspondent banking, sterling clearances, asset freezes, debt and equity restrictions, prohibitions on other types of transactions. And this really what it does is makes it difficult to process transactions or clear funds through not just UK banks, but others, including EU and US banking systems, where the transactions are handled obviously in dollars or euros. And I think that's one of the biggest impacts, because as banks contract what is available and the sanctions contract the financial instruments available, it becomes very much more difficult area to work with. And other banks, particularly European and Asian banks, will de-risk their activities to a degree, which then has the effect of spreading that out. Not all transactions are prohibited, so it's sometimes easy to sort of spread this too far. But again, we have to look at the specifics of each particular transaction, and every single company will have different impacts. Obviously, the risk of financial sanctions is if you effectively weaponize them to such a degree, you might drive Russia or Belarus, which is now seeing sanctions coming in, find other ways of dealing with countries and other ways of dealing economically. So really what we're seeing in terms of the sanctions, we're going to get more sanctions coming in. We're seeing that at the moment. They're not quite at the end. It is quite extreme. And I think one report in the last couple of days described Russia as being the financial pariah now, having greater sanctions than even Iran saw at the height. We're going to see potentially more blocking. Oligarchs particularly, we've seen a range of oligarchs today from the UK, particularly Roman Abramovich. We've seen their family members become more sanctioned. If you look at US sanctions, we've got things like the 50% rule, where you have to look at the level of ownership. So they are really, really complex. Specific transactions in investments, new debt and equity, US dollar transactions, they're all going to be impacted by the US sanctions statutes. And so when you start looking more broadly globally, this is where we start to impact on supply chains, and we look at what licenses might have to become available. We also need to consider in the mix things like export controls. And so export controls in the UK are managed by the Export Control Joint Unit. And these cover not just the export controls of military and dual-use items, and we've seen changes to the dual-use items licensing regime in the UK. We also have trade sanctions, which Export Control Joint Unit is responsible for. And those regulations really impose trade prohibitions relating to things like critical industry goods and technology, aviation and space goods and technology, energy-related goods, provision of technical assistance. So that could be either provision of technical assistance to armed personnel or through financial services, associated brokering services. And when I say brokering, that is where if you are in the UK, you would be arranging or facilitating transactions or sales between two third countries. There are also going to be restrictions in some of the services offered. So relevant, to the infrastructure sector, particularly in Crimea, or other infrastructure related goods, and some tourism related services as well. So, they can be quite broad and wide ranging. And again, looking further outside the UK, the Bureau of Industry and Security in the US, OFAC sanctions, all of those will have an impact. And across the EU and Switzerland, and I believe Switzerland now has the highest number of entities and individuals they have sanctioned. They're following them, tracking the EU sanctions, but they've gone even further in some instances. So it's really interesting looking at the different jurisdictions. But again, it sort of plays out as to how complex this picture is. When we look at, again, the trade sanctions, we have to take into the mix not just, as I say, those things, the physical things, the actual activities, but we look at those transport sanctions. And that's something, again, you've probably seen in news recently, where we have new shipping sanctions. So the regulations prohibit Russian ships and other ships, which are specified by the Secretary of State, from entering ports in the UK. What we look at is actually the ownership of those ships, not necessarily what they're carrying. And this can cause confusion and concern. And again, when we're looking at aircraft sanctions, they prohibit maybe Russian aircraft owned or chartered being operated by persons connected with Russia or designated persons operating in the UK airspace. And again, restrict them landing and taking off from the United Kingdom. So again, very difficult, complex area that needs to be considered. And it doesn't affect all businesses. It's not necessarily going to affect a large number of businesses. But it's one of those things that goes to building this picture as to how wide-ranging these can be. And again, breaches of financial and trade sanctions can be serious criminal offences. If you're very unfortunate, they can carry a maximum sentence of 7 years in prison or a fine. But again, it's really looking on balance how each set of sanctions impacts on different businesses and how they might impact on supply chains, how they maybe impact on the finance of supply chains and different businesses' ability to be able to manage within those global supply chains. So I think just before I hand over to David, a couple of sort of key takeaways before we do the questions. I think really businesses need to be reviewing supply chains for areas of risk. Businesses really need to understand who their customer is, where their customer is, and what their customer does. They need to really understand their products, so to the point of checking commodity codes, and you can use things like the checker on gov.uk. Look at the tariff selectors, and under that, and you work through each of the different chapters, but again, within that, it shows you where the new export and potentially import licensing requirements are, because there are restrictions on some imports now as well. We also need to look at and consider what the product origin is. So previously, that's normally looked at more in terms of customs compliance. What customs and border officials are particularly looking at now are what is the origin of product, not just in terms of tariffs and duties, but does that need a license? Do we know where that product is now going? Do we know whether it can go there with that particular origin? we need to look at indirect supply to Russia or Belarus. Are we actually sending something or dealing with customers in one region, and there's a risk of diversion? So there you need to know also, what is within your delivery channels. So if we look at supply chains overall, it's really about understanding what that whole trade journey is, knowing who your supplier is and what you're getting from them, understanding the origin, understanding any restrictions around it, looking for any alternative sources of supply, understanding your own operations and how that is managed, and how any of the sanctions difficulties might impact on your ability to make payments or receive payments. And again, revisiting whether you have any licensing requirements or delivery channel restrictions that might reduce the ability for you to do business in particular parts of the world. Now, what I'm going to do before we go into any more detail on that is hand over to David. David, you can give an overview of your part.
Great, thanks very much indeed, Julia, and good afternoon, everybody. Some of you I know, many of you I don't know. I'm going to talk a bit about the supply chain risks emanating from what's really a seismic change in the geostrategic position here. As if anybody needed any reminder about what we're actually living through. The assumptions, the practices, the processes that were in place, political, economic, security, up until a couple of weeks ago have shifted. There's been a tectonic shift. So we need to work out what all that means, and that will take a bit of time. And what we do in the short term and the longer term. I think from a supply chain point of view, there are nuances depending on which sector we're talking about here. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail over each particular sector, but the sort of sectors that we're talking about here are clearly commodities, so the raw materials that are exported from Russia. We're looking at products such as automotive, we're looking at retail, consumer, and we're looking at agricultural products. All of those have an effect both on the demand side and on the supply side. So what I want to do is just have a little look at some of the moving parts there in the near term and in the longer term, because there are some common themes, I think, across those sectors. So firstly, in the short term, what do we see? Well, clearly there's going to be a drop in demand, and there already is a drop in demand from the Russian market for all sorts of things. I think, I'll say slightly tongue-in-cheek, that might actually come as a bit of a relief for some companies for whom doing business in Russia over the last 25 years has been a challenge and remains a challenge. I know from my own contacts and some of the work that I've done with some of the multinationals who have really struggled to maintain viable businesses in Russia, that this is hard graft. Having a footprint in Russia and making it work. So I sense there's probably a bit of a sigh of relief, albeit with a loss of a substantial market share. But for multinationals, is the Russian market going to suddenly result in the implosion of their business? I don't think so. It will take a bit of adjustment. So a shrinkage on the demand side in the Russian market, which we're seeing playing through now. And I think there's much more to come on that. I think it's probably going to be in the sort of manageable range for most businesses. I think the interesting side for me anyway is really on the supply side. And we're really looking here, I think, oil and gas. We're seeing the response to the constriction of supply and the application of sanctions in the oil and gas sector playing through. The oil price dropped hopefully yesterday, and you could see that the market will adjust pretty quickly to the loss of Russian oil. There is plenty of supply. It may take a week or two for it to ramp up and get to where it needs to get to. Likewise with gas, stand fast Central Europe or mainland Europe, of course, with gas supply. I think there's a challenge around agriculture and cereals. Ukraine and bits of Russia, breadbasket of lots of the world in terms of grain supplies. And I think that's a long-term adjustment that will need to happen, and we can certainly expect to see a spike in prices there. And likewise, some rare raw materials, for which Russia is a big supplier. The market will adjust, we'll find alternative sources of supply, but that may take some time, and we may see some dependent price spikes along with that. So I think it's interesting to, well, it's more than interesting to play out what might happen next in Ukraine. And, you know, none of us have a crystal ball. None of us know what's inside Mr. Putin's head. But depending what happens next will clearly drive what happens to supply chains. And maybe there are, you know, three scenarios that we could look at. One is that Russia sort of stops where it is, consolidates its gains, if you can call them that, and then has to manage that situation, which will continue to result in, you know, civil unrest, migration of populations, a shriveling of the economy, that would enable Russia to say, you know, we've grabbed back the bits that we think are really important. Another scenario is Russia's defeated. Difficult to see it being as clean as that. Another scenario is Russia keeps pressing. I think all of those things continue to feed uncertainty. So what we do know is we've got an unprecedented level of Western collaboration, politically, economically, and from a security point of view. And it's difficult to see how that consolidated and united front would fragment under any of those scenarios that I've just laid out. So in terms of the supply side tensions and the demand side tensions, I think we'll just continue to see those being managed by businesses as and when you know, issues arise. I think it's worth probably just spending a couple of minutes talking about what might possibly develop militarily. So those three big scenarios around stop and consolidate, defeat, or keep pressing. It's not inconceivable that we might start to see some pressure in the maritime domain. Black Sea is the obvious place. International waters, but with a couple of really difficult constriction points there. So we could see some pressure applied by the Russians there to control exit and entry to the Black Sea. I think a more interesting, if I could use that word, potential area of tension is in the Baltics. And it's quite possible you could see Putin just testing again Western resolve by some sort of asymmetric activity in the Baltics, whether that's as a prelude to further adventures in the Baltic states, or whether that's just a test and let's see what the response is. I don't know. And again, that could be, you know, typical sub-threshold stuff, non-attributable stuff. Whatever that may or may not look like will clearly create confidence challenges around shipping and so on and so forth, raise questions around how you execute maritime security, pull in more military resources to secure those sea lanes and so on. So it wouldn't surprise me if we saw some sort of asymmetric threat in the Black Sea region in due course, not least if Putin decides he just wants to consolidate his gains in eastern, northern, and southern Ukraine, but still wants to continue to press the West. So that's a sort of short-term view. Let's have a look at some of the longer-term things. I think, you know, I'll take a cup half view of events, cup half full view of events. I think it's definitely in China's interests to maintain some semblance of rules-based system so they can continue to trade. And I think we see that playing out, not perhaps overtly, but it's difficult to see how China would wish to do anything other than continue to trade with the West and have at least pragmatic relationships with the West. So those trade routes I see staying open, and the supply base that sits in China and the demand that goes the other way into China, I think will be pretty robust. But I think the big thing that I would think around businesses, and we've had a couple of dry runs at this over the last couple of years, what with COVID, what with adventures in the Suez Canal and so on. You know, transportation, whether it's air freight, whether it's maritime, whether it's land, is typically a race to the bottom in terms of price. And I think we all get that. But I think we've got to look at investing in supply chain resilience. And off the top of your head, that thinks, oh, well, I just make a bigger stockpile, or I'll go a little bit more broad for my supply base. And both of those things are true. So I think businesses in physical supply chain domains do need to invest some working capital and increasing their stockpile. They do need to invest some time, effort into onshoring or nearshoring. Some of that stuff's underway. Some businesses, I know, are just holding their breath and hope that things will return to normal. That ain't going to happen. But I think, as well as accepting additional costs around stockpiling and different suppliers, I do think it's worth businesses investing in knowledge. And by that, I mean in really understanding the markets that they're selling into and really understanding their supply chains. Sanctions and the legal dimension that Julie's outlined are definitely a part of that. So, there is a cost associated with acquiring enough knowledge to make sure that you're not putting your business at risk by compromising sanctions. But I also do think that investment is required to understand better the geostrategic position. And I know some of that goes on, particularly for the maritime insurance industry, but the businesses really understand where the kind of military choke points are, where the real areas of risk are, what the West might do in response to action A, B, or C from Putin, and the levers that they can pull in order to make sure that their business remains resilient. Now, as I say, supply chain, physical supply chain, whether it's air freight or maritime freight or land freight, has typically not invested a huge amount in knowledge because it's such a price competitive business. But I do think to be able to de-risk those physical supply chain operations, transportation operations, it does merit some sort of investment in acquiring the knowledge you need to be able to manage those risks. And I might just finish by drawing a comparison with commercial supply chain planning and military supply chain planning. I mentioned that the price competitiveness around physical movement assets in the commercial world, absolutely get that. What that drives you to is looking at what it cost yesterday, looking at what the demand is today, and spot pricing and so on and so forth. What it doesn't encourage you to do is look over the horizon. So, military supply chain planner will typically be looking at a range of scenarios to try to understand what those moving parts are and to design a supply chain that accommodates those. It will typically look to invest in putting people on the ground that can solve problems rather than looking at yesterday's data or last week's data or tomorrow's pricing points in order to make decisions, in order to and hope that it works. The military supply chains will typically be command and controlled from end to end, not entirely so, but they'll make sure that they de-risk where it needs to be de-risked, whereas commercial supply chains typically are fragmented. You'll have 3PLs, 4PLs, and all sorts of other agents involved. Question mark, is that a sensible way to de-risk end-to-end supply chains in such a risky environment? And I also think that creating what I would describe as a contingent mindset, so expecting things to go wrong rather than expect tomorrow to be like yesterday, is a key part of understanding how you manage the risk in the supply chain. So unsurprisingly, I'm an advocate of, I wouldn't say a cut and paste of military approach to supply chain planning, but elements of how the military approaches supply chain planning in an uncertain world, I think is a really important kind of set of considerations that industry could think of. And certainly in terms of investing in the knowledge that helps people understand where the risks are, I think is a key part of where businesses need to be in the coming years. I'll stop there because I've prattled on for long enough, and I look forward to your questions and comments.
Thanks ever so much, David and Julia. That was really interesting. So we have a few questions come in, and perhaps I could turn to Julia first. And one of the this is a fairly obvious question. So somebody's come up with we don't deal with Russia directly, and so how might these sanctions impact our business, even if we don't deal with Russia directly?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question, and it actually sort of goes to the fact that we have so many sanctions that are so broad that they touch different businesses in many different ways, through ownership, through different entity control. So I think a case in point this morning, I mentioned Roman Abramovich before. It came out from Office of Financial Sanctions implementation this morning that a number of other Russian oligarchs, and there's been many, have been sanctioned. He obviously owns Chelsea Football Club, which has, apart from his ownership, has nothing else to do with Russia. It doesn't operate in Russia. But that's going to impact on the way they can manage their payments, that they can raise funds. It's impacting on people who even want to buy tickets, if they haven't already bought tickets. Merchandisers. So you look at, if you haven't got a merchandise contract before the 10th of March, you can't then go and put in place new merchandising. So it's not just around the sort of typical things that you see, it's much broader. If you look at the high level of Russian ownership in the African economy, for example, there are large numbers of carriers and shipping companies that are owned, multiple companies in the Middle East. So where you start to see the sanctions really start to take hold and impact other companies is through their supply chains. It's through company ownership and restrictions and asset freezes. That you may not be able to deal with those companies in the way that you would dealt with them previously. The other way that it can impact is actually, and it goes to what David is saying about the restrictions in the supply chain. So again, looking at the Wall Street Journal, the report coming through that this morning are the fracking industry in the US. There are limits on how much and how quickly they can boost oil supplies, for instance. And that comes down to the fact that the drillers themselves are facing supply chain constraints, which are, equipment shortages, labour, the sand or the drilling muds that are used for fracking and these sorts of things. So it's very much looking at the sort of broader impacts and understanding sort of where those touch points are along your own supply chains, and putting in place, mitigation strategies, making sure that you're resourced up, not just in your compliance departments, but actually looking at each different function within the business and understanding where they may have risk in terms of project delivery, sales delivery. Do the sales departments know what they can negotiate on now? Are they restricted in dealing with certain third parties? Are they restricted in even dealing with certain third-party logistic providers, like David was saying? Because a number of vessels, hauliers, carriers themselves are finding their way onto the restricted lists. And it's making sure that you've got the appropriate measures in place in terms of your internal compliance programs. Hopefully that sort of covers that one.
Thanks, Julie. I mean, it poses another question from me, and that's it. There are obviously so many sanctions and laws coming in on a day-by-day basis, it seems. How on earth are we expected to companies expected to keep up with this?
Yeah, and it's really difficult actually, because there's just a sea of sanctions that seem to be coming in, and even for the most savvy and the most knowledgeable lawyers and large businesses, it can be quite difficult. There is some leeway. So if we look at some of the regimes, like the Office of Foreign Assets Control in the US, and again, OFSI in the UK, they've issued some wind down licenses, which give companies a little bit of breathing space to be able to get their heads around what's happening and to be able to start winding down, restricting the activities that might be impacted. Unfortunately, if you look at the EU, they don't have quite so many wind downs. But again, it's making sure that you are looking at what is commensurate with the size and commercial and sophistication of your business. Regulators, they understand that companies are really going to be, scrambling to do these things. And sanction compliance, again, it's not just for banks and financial sectors. It goes across multiple sectors. And it's not just, infrastructure and technology. It's much broader across supply chains. So it's understanding how companies can resource initially very, very quickly to try and look at what impact this is having, the geographic areas of their operation, their lines of business, understanding, where that might impact, and then right-sizing the response that they need to or they can. And again, as I say, it's not just the compliance departments. As David said, it's investing in those time and resources across your different functional areas of the business, to make sure that you're responding in the most appropriate way, not just with a compliance-heavy response.
Thanks, Julie. David, obviously one of the things that is, very worrying about how the supply chain will be disrupted, but other things that companies can do in the short term that actually might minimize this disruption?
Yeah, I think I suppose there's some practical things that people can do, but there is also some cultural things I think that that people can adjust to making. So I mentioned before that generally speaking, and it is a generalization, that businesses operate on a lot of data around sales, around demand, around availability to supply, and so on and so forth. So they tend to be kind of data driven. It's yesterday's sales of avocados, or it's tomorrow's sales of iron ore, or whatever. Generally speaking, it's repeatable, known, and so on and so forth. I think the thing that people can do is kind of break out of the mindset that everything is rooted in that data, and look at broader sense of perhaps less quantifiable reference points around how that's going to affect demand, how that's going to affect your ability to ship, how that's going to affect flipping back through to the sanctions business. Where are those touch points where I could be at risk in my business with sanctions? So I think it's more broad. It's thinking more broadly around those physical risk factors, not being mesmerized by yesterday's sales spreadsheet or tomorrow's demand forecast. It's how can I take a broader approach to understand all those moving parts, which historically I've been able to ignore because it's been the same yesterday as it was tomorrow. It's the same this year as it was last year, and so on and so forth. And I reiterate my point that we've had a couple of runs up this hill the last couple of years. What is around COVID hasn't affected every sector in quite the same way, but it has affected a number of sectors. And the second one was the disruption in the Suez Canal by the big ship from Evergreen. And again, whilst that only affected some sectors, consumer and retail mainly, it's a really good example of a small event causing a huge amount of disruption and by extension undermining confidence in other things. And I suppose confidence is such a key thing around all business. And you build confidence by understanding the environment that you're operating in, rather than hunkering down over a spreadsheet and just kind of blocking out all those other things. I'm being slightly disparaging in the way that I say this, but I can't stress enough that understanding that external operating environment is absolutely key to be able to plan your business and be able to invest and so on and so forth.
Thanks, David. So another question in, and this is probably directed at Julia. What are you hearing from banks and insurance providers in terms of their de-risking? The impact of those actors simply blocking, and risk will go well past individual businesses being sure about their compliance.
So I think this goes to sort of an element of sanctions shock at the moment that all financial institutions and businesses are going through. And it very much, it depends on a banking's internal policy as to how hard over they're going to be. From some areas, what we're hearing is that particularly some of the smaller European and Asian banks will be risk averse in terms of their dealings. And that's predominantly due to reports coming from the Financial Conduct Authority in the UK. They've issued some guidance about tightening up making sure that banks and other institutions are being really, really aware and checking for, sanctions breaches, and where some of the actors on these lists are being, trying to navigate their way around sanctions, which very much impacts on the risk profile that a bank will have. Again, there are things in the EU, they've just launched their whistleblowing hotline, and Officer for Foreign Assets Control has issued a statement saying, they're actively following up on sanction breaches and sanction breach reports. So at the moment, there is this very much tightening and enhanced oversight, particularly where we're looking at, if you look at the flow of a dollar, we need to restrict the flow of that dollar. Russian counter sanctions are trying to get as many dollars in. So if you look on the flip side, in Russia, 80% of sales that are made in dollars need to be converted to rubles and banked. And there is a lot of Russian regulation now coming into play, which is also, again, not very well understood and making the risk profile of financial institutions that little bit more edgy. It's not useful for businesses because how they actually manage their own sort of loans and other financial instruments, it does make it a little bit more difficult. The general asset freezes make it a bit more difficult. But it shouldn't contract everything to the point of stop. And so that's really where we go next, is understanding when we move past these wind down periods, which sort of will come 27th of March for the US and 3rd of April for the UK. Once we go past those wind down periods and start to understand what that sort of new level playing field is, we'll be able to then maybe come back and give a better indication as to what that then looks like.
Thank you, Julia. So another one come in. Sort of what type of things should companies be doing to assess any sanctions risk? Right. And again, I think it's really looking at your internal compliance program and understanding how you're managing that. So I think the key thing for me is really, first of all, making sure that you're performing a risk assessment. Look at where you're operating, understand if you've got a high volume of trade with Russia, for instance, through your APAC regions. Be actively in updating your teams and your key stakeholders with this information. And also make sure that you're looking and prioritizing your resources and mapping out your supply chain. The other thing, because of just the volume of sanctions, really look and make sure that you've got an effective screening process, that, particularly where we're getting the implementation of new sanctions as they're announced, you're then able to review your client list, you're then able to review your supplier list to see if there's been any impact, and make sure that that's translated elsewhere in the company. There's no point, if you're a large company, just doing it centrally once. It needs to be down through the divisions. And again, if you're a small company, there are lots and lots of providers out there that can run sort of bulk screening for you. But it's really important to make sure that that's done on a really regular period. Again, look at the nature and destination of your exports, understand where they're going. Is that technology going to be a dual use good or an item? Are you transferring technical data or information through email, designs, drawings? Potentially that will be covered. There are new technologies and emerging technologies, cloud technologies, that will all need to be considered in the mix, where you have your servers and what information is held on those and how they're accessed, who is accessing them. That potentially can change. And the other key thing is really to make sure you act quickly, because the expectation is that really best practice in terms of sanction screening is that it's done within 24 to 48 hours and that you're able to. Sometimes that's not possible, but what it is really crucial to do is make sure that you're doing it as quickly as possible to identify any areas that you then need to restrict or remove or de-scope from your programs and projects.
And then if you have found a potential breach, then the other really key thing is to make sure that you are taking the best legal advice you can, and that you are reporting any of those breaches within, I think OFAC is within 10 days. But if you are looking at any potential breach, it's really, really worth your while to make sure that you have gone to the regulator and identified that as soon as possible. And if it goes across different jurisdictions, it may be that you need to approach more than one regulator. So it's really understanding what your internal compliance program is and making sure you've got the right steps in place, the right controls, and the right record keeping.
Thank you, Julia. And presumably, if anybody's worried about this, you're there to help them via UDSS.
Yes, of course. Yeah, absolutely.
Excellent. I think we're running out of time on this, and although we've got some more questions in the chat room, I fear we'll have to answer those separately and offline. But in the meanwhile, thank you all for attending, and particular thanks to Julia and David for giving up your time and talking to us about this sort of fascinating and highly relevant subjects. So once again, thank you both very much indeed, and thank you, audience, for listening.